Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to parts of Unit 7, The Presidency of Andrew Jackson, Manifest Destiny, and the Age of Reform. Special note, this PowerPoint does not contain all the required information for this unit. Many key ideas will appear in class, in my Know Me lessons, and on the video lessons for this PowerPoint. So we covered some key things over the course of these three presentations. Part 1 of the PowerPoint was Jacksonian democracy. Part 2 was Manifest Destiny and Westward expansion. And this is Part 3, reform movements. This is during the 1800s. Sometimes it's called the antebellum era, or antebellum era reform movements. Okay, so we're talking about the reform. That's our focus for this entire presentation. So what exactly is that? Well, let's explore what that is. So this is change for improvement. That's what it's all about. You see things in society that you don't like, problems, and you want to change them. You want to fix them. You want to make things better for your country, for the world. So what were the main impulses that drove people during this era to actually want to change society? Well, there was an increase in the faith in human nature, this belief in the goodness of the individual. We had a desire for order and control, a desire to remake society, and there were several religious and moral impulses that went along with these ideas, with this driving force that made us want to change things. So a couple of key ideas we're going to focus on. We're going to talk about Romanticism. We're going to talk about the Transcendentalists. I'm not going to spend much time on utopian societies, but anybody viewing this who might be in 11th grade, this is something you're going to want to focus on. We're going to talk about the Second Great Awakening, the Temperance Crusade, very briefly because there's going to be additional details about this in my Know Me lesson, women's suffrage, and abolitionism. So these are the things we're going to talk about. My prime foci, if you will, for this presentation is going to be the Transcendentalist movement, abolitionism, early suffrage, and the Second Great Awakening, just to help us focus this presentation. So, Transcendentalist principles. What exactly is Transcendentalism? Well, I have the definition on that first bullet. The idea of Transcendentalism is you're in this ideal spiritual state that transcends, which means to rise above or go beyond the physical and the empirical world. All right, and now Transcendentalism was a collection of all these very different ideas that involve philosophy, literature, religion, social reform, and American culture. It was very individualistic. It was not a religion, but it was a philosophy or a spiritual state of being, and many of the Transcendentalists, at least early on, worked with religious reformers as well. And it emphasized intuition over the rational or physical. This is in direct contrast to the Enlightenment, which was all about the physical world. It was all about human rationale, okay, the ability of humans to be rational. And Transcendentalists focus instead on intuition, on emotion. So let me give you some historical background to this movement. It actually stems from this thing called Romanticism. It started in Europe in the 18th and 19th centuries, and this movement was a direct response to the Enlightenment, which was primarily in the 18th century. Key authors and thinkers of the Enlightenment, which should be familiar to you, Immanuel Kant, John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Voltaire, and Montesquieu. Okay, so these are all names that you should be familiar with, but this is how Transcendentalism started in the United States. It came from the Romanticism in Europe. So in the United States, it's the American version of Romanticism, and we have a few key thinkers that I want you to keep in mind. And my folks, we're going to explore a few of these folks in class. We're going to read some of their documents, some excerpts, just to give you a sense of what they were like. Ralph Waldo Emerson, Henry David Thoreau, Margaret Fuller. In the early 19th century, as I said before, Transcendentalists worked with religious reformers to improve education, living conditions, and the political rights of minorities. They were also all about manifest destiny, the idea that the United States was God's chosen country and that its mission was to expand westward and spread democratic ideals. If you're looking for more details about manifest destiny, check out part 2 of this series of PowerPoints, and that will give you all the breakdown that you need. So later in the 19th century, it split. Transcendentalism, that is, splits from religious movements and becomes very secular. And with this split, you have this development of independent American art forms. And you see a depiction of that here. That's an example of a Transcendentalist art piece. And if you watched part 2 of my presentation, you'll recognize it because we reviewed it in that presentation. Now we're moving into the abolitionist movement. It was the 1820s was about when it started. The purpose was to free African Americans from slavery. The initial leader was a white radical named William Lloyd Garrison. An abolitionist basically called for immediate emancipation, freeing of all slaves, like now, like yesterday, like this has been going on too long as it is. So William Lloyd Garrison had a couple of key arguments that I want you to keep in mind. He said slavery undermined Republican values, immediate emancipation with no compensation, which basically meant that all slave owners had to free their slaves, and they would receive no money in exchange for what they thought was their property. So you can imagine how this went over with Southerners. They were not too happy. But Garrison said slavery is a moral issue. It's not an economic one. So you can just take your economic arguments and you can stick it, because this is a moral issue that we need to deal with as a country. Harriet Tubman was also a very famous abolitionist. She ran the Underground Railroad, and there were stations, as you call them, homes, barns, woods. There were various trails north. She herself went on 19 missions and single-handedly freed over 300 people. So she was an amazing, amazing reformer in her own right, and it's important that you know who that is. Harriet Tubman, very important. Frederick Douglass is another important abolitionist. He was a former slave, and he was able to escape to freedom. And once he did, this guy was brilliant. He's one of the most brilliant people in all of United States history, an absolute genius. He published the North Star, which was an abolitionist magazine, and helped support the Underground Railroad. And he also published The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, which detailed his early years, what his life was like, and how he was able to escape to freedom. My folks, we're going to actually read some excerpts of that narrative in class. It's very important. It's very profound. This man was just amazing. He was an extremely powerful orator and very successful at advancing the mission of abolitionism. Really, really important guy. Another important lady, Harriet Beecher Stowe. She was an author. She was an abolitionist. She wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. Uncle Tom's Cabin was this amazing, amazing book that you'd think at the time would not be that popular, but it was insanely popular. It was a runaway bestseller, selling 10,000 copies in the U.S. in its first week alone, 300,000 in the first year, and in Great Britain, 1.5 million. Absolutely amazing. We're also going to read some excerpts from Harriet Beecher Stowe in class as well. This is an amazing work of literature, very, very true to life, and it basically tells the story. It shares with America what a slave's life was like, and it really brought home the issue of slavery to a lot of folks who really, they didn't like it, but they weren't really too sure what it was all about. Well, this really made it plain and very clear, and people were horrified by what they read, and it really galvanized people to action. So now we're moving into women and the start of the suffrage movement. So you have the women's suffrage movement moves into high gear in the 1840s. Women were active in virtually every single reform movement. You don't have social reform without women. So this is a very important time period in American history for women having power and having force and being effective in changing how the country works. The 1800s offered opportunities for women to be educated, and you have the development of the separate spheres concept, this cult of domesticity. Women should be in the home. That was their primary role, but in the home, they had to civilize their husband and family. So you might wonder, well, how does education factor into this? Well, if women are going to civilize their husband and family and properly raise their children, they need to have a basic level of education so that they can adequately teach their children what they need to know. This is what opened the door for women to actually have access to education, so it's very important. So, early 19th century American women could not do the following things. They couldn't vote. They were not considered an adult. If she was single, she could own her own property. She was married. She had no control over property or children. She could not initiate divorce. She could not make wills, sign a contract, or bring a suit in court without her husband's permission. So women really didn't have a whole lot of rights right now. Now we're moving into the Second Great Awakening. So this happened between the 1790s and 1830s or 1840s. It focused on personal conversion and individual perfection. It turned religious energies towards social reform. So this is a distinct difference from the First Great Awakening. The First Great Awakening was all about developing a personal relationship with God. It was more individualistic. With the Second Great Awakening, people are taking that energy and that excitement about religion and about faith and using it to cure social ills. And this manifested most prominently in the temperance movement, which is an anti-alcohol movement. This was a movement across the country to ban alcohol. It culminated with prohibition in the early 1900s, but that's past past our curriculum, so I'm not going to talk about prohibition too much, but the temperance movement was really what made prohibition possible. So it's very important that you have a sense of what that is. So let me give you a little quick, down and dirty compare and contrast of the first versus the second Great Awakening. So the first Great Awakening, you see the years there. There was a lot of fervor and emotion and prayer. You wanted to develop a closer relationship with God. There was religious power was in human hands. It was not in that of the church. It was a very democratic, individual kind of thing. The retaliation of God for the sins of humanity. God was punisher and savior. So it was very much hellfire and brimstone. Jonathan Edwards is probably one of the most, if not the most, famous preacher from this period. He preached hellfire and brimstone, and his famous book, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, was really, really a very big deal. We took a look at excerpts from that in class. My guys did anyway. The Second Great Awakening, by contrast, there are a lot of things that are very similar. The fervor and emotion, the closer relationship with God, religious power in human hands, that's all the same. Now we start to differentiate. Mass conversions. We're talking thousands of people in a big old field listening to an itinerant preacher, a really charismatic preacher, just converting the masses. They would all convert at once. There's a lot of internal moral reform, which is shared by the First Great Awakening, but now you have the addition of the outward social reform. You have to take your conversion and manifest it outward, actually do something with it in the larger society. God was benevolent, and nature was an extension of heaven. Now that idea ties right in line with manifest destiny. The idea that we were connected to nature, it ties into transcendentalism. So I want you to start to see the connections between the various reform movements. An exercise of free will actually allowed followers to be proactive in solving social ills and also in curing their own sin, or at least effectively dealing with their own sin. So there was a lot more proactivity involved here with the Second Great Awakening versus the first. So just to give you a nice little breakdown here, this is a slide I borrowed from Susan Poher from PowerPoint Palooza. It's an excellent slide. I love this breakdown. So spiritual reform from within, it's about religious revivalism. You have social reforms and redefining the ideal of what it means to be equal. So you have the temperance movement, asylum and penal reform, abolitionism, women's rights, and education. So all of these reform movements in large part stemmed from this religious fervor, this desire to take your spiritual excitement and do something useful with it for the rest of humanity. That was a major driving force for the Reform era. All right, so key ideas from part 3 that we talked about. We talked about women's suffrage, we talked about abolitionism, we talked about the Transcendentalist movement. We also talked about the Second Great Awakening and several other key concepts, but I want to highlight those for you. I hope that you enjoyed this. I hope you learned what you needed to learn, and I will see you next time. This is the end of Unit 7.